Imagine trying to make a sword without steel, without power tools, without a factory, and without even knowing what a sword is supposed to look like. All you have is a fire, some strange rocks pulled from the ground, and a piece of soft, dull metal. Yet somehow, ancient humans turned that into one of history's most iconic weapons. So how did they actually do it? The first sword wasn't simply a bigger knife. It required humans to solve an entirely new engineering problem, one that had never existed before. And the strangest part is that the first swords weren't even made from the metal most people expect. Not steel. Not even bronze. Not at first. This is a story that starts with something far softer, far more fragile, and far less obviously capable of becoming a weapon at all. Long before anyone forged a sword, humans already carried weapons that had served them for generations. Stone blades, chipped and sharpened by hand, edges napped flake by flake until they could split flesh and bone. Wooden clubs, heavy and simple, requiring nothing more than strength and aim. Spears, extending reach beyond an arm's length, letting a hunter strike before an animal, or an enemy, ever got close. Axes, capable of cutting through wood and bone alike, doubling as both tool and weapon depending on the moment. And by the 4th millennium BCE, copper daggers entered the picture, short-bladed tools that archaeological research connects directly to advances in early copper metalworking. Each of these was already proven. Each of these already worked. The sword didn't appear out of nowhere. It grew directly out of all of this, out of thousands of years of humans slowly learning what a blade could do. So if humans already had daggers, sharp, functional, proven in use, why would anyone bother making a blade several times longer? The basic idea sounds almost embarrassingly simple. Take a familiar blade and make it longer. But that single change created a genuinely difficult new problem, one that no dagger maker had ever needed to think about. A short dagger can stay relatively rigid in the hand, resisting bending under normal use, because there simply isn't enough length for the metal to flex. A long blade behaves completely differently. Stretch that same metal out, and it becomes far more likely to bend, snap, or warp under the stress of impact, especially at the moment it matters most, in the middle of a strike. Length wasn't just a bigger version of the same object. It was a different engineering challenge entirely, one that would take generations to properly solve. Archaeological finds show humans were already experimenting with unusually long metal blades by the early Bronze Age. A copper sword recovered from Megiddo has been dated to roughly 3300 to 2900 BCE, and similarly early examples come from sites like Arslantepe, evidence that this experimentation wasn't confined to one isolated workshop or region, but was happening in more than one place, among people who likely never even knew of one another's existence. But before anyone could reliably make a long sword, they first had to learn how to control the metal itself. And that meant mastering something that, on its surface, looks almost like magic. This is where metallurgy enters the story. Somewhere, generations of trial and error taught early metalworkers to recognize copper-bearing ore, rock that looked ordinary to an untrained eye but held something else hidden inside it, something that could be coaxed out with enough heat and patience. That ore had to be gathered, then heated inside a furnace fed with charcoal, temperatures climbing high enough to coax the metal out of the stone surrounding it. Picture it happening in real time: someone crouched beside a glowing furnace, feeding it fuel, watching stone slowly change into something entirely different. Molten copper pooling at the base, ready to be poured into a waiting mold. That transformation, rock into liquid metal, was itself a genuine technological leap, long before anyone shaped it into a weapon at all. To someone who had never seen it before, it must have looked less like craftsmanship and more like something close to sorcery. But molten copper alone wasn't a sword. The real challenge came next, turning that metal into something with an actual blade, an edge sharp enough to matter and a shape balanced enough to use. Some of the earliest swords were made not from bronze, the alloy most people automatically associate with this era, but from copper or arsenical copper instead. The British Museum holds an early Bronze Age copper sword dated to roughly 2400 to 2000 BCE, direct physical proof that copper itself, not yet alloyed with anything else, was already being shaped into sword-length weapons. And the process behind that shaping is visible in the archaeological record too. A copper blade from Cyprus, dated to approximately 2300 to 1950 BCE, shows clear evidence of being cast, hammered, and annealed, meaning it was poured into shape inside a mold, worked and strengthened by repeated hammering along its length, then carefully reheated to relieve internal stress before being sharpened for use. Each of these steps had to be learned the hard way, through blades that cracked, warped, or shattered before the technique was finally understood. But copper had a real problem, one that no amount of skilled hammering could fully solve. It's a relatively soft metal, and a soft metal makes for an unreliable weapon, prone to bending exactly when you'd need it most, in the middle of impact against another blade or a shield. So how could something this soft ever become a blade you could actually trust in a fight? The next major breakthrough came from combining metals rather than simply working with copper alone. Craftsmen learned to alloy copper with tin, and that combination produced bronze, a material with genuinely different properties than either metal on its own: harder, more durable, and far better suited to holding an edge. This wasn't something discovered overnight in a single flash of insight. It came from accumulating knowledge across generations, understanding which ores produced usable copper, locating sources of tin, which was often far rarer and harder to find than copper itself, learning the right furnace temperatures for melting and combining two different metals, and gradually working out the correct proportions needed to alloy the two together successfully. The exact path toward this knowledge likely differed from one region to another, shaped by whatever ore and tin sources happened to be locally available, but the destination, once reached, changed what was actually possible. Bronze could be cast into more sophisticated shapes, and it held an edge, in its overall form, far more reliably than copper ever had. Now craftsmen could make longer, sturdier blades. But a sword isn't just a blade. There was still one problem left to solve, one that had nothing to do with metal at all. A blade without a secure handle is barely more useful than a sharpened rock. Ancient craftsmen had to figure out how to permanently and reliably join blade to grip, a connection that would need to survive the same repeated stress the blade itself did, the shock of impact traveling straight down into the hand holding it. Some Bronze Age swords solved this through riveted construction: separate cast components, blade and hilt, joined together using metal rivets driven through matching holes drilled with care. One Middle Bronze Age European sword, held today by the Met, is built from exactly this kind of two-piece construction, cast separately and then locked permanently together, tangs extended from the blade into the handle, anchoring the two pieces. Shoulders provided a stable transition point where blade met grip, spreading out the stress instead of concentrating it in one weak spot. Wood or other organic material wrapped around that core to form something a hand could actually hold and control, sometimes finished with a pommel at the base to balance the weapon and keep it from slipping free during use, even when the hand holding it was slick with sweat. Once blade and handle finally worked together as a single, dependable weapon, the sword became something considerably more than just a tool. It became a symbol. Owning a sword required real metal resources, specialized knowledge passed down through skilled craftsmen, and a significant amount of labor, none of it cheap, none of it available to just anyone. A farmer could carve a wooden club in an afternoon. A sword demanded ore, fuel, a furnace, a craftsman's years of training, and time that most people simply didn't have to spare. The Met notes that from their very emergence in the 3rd millennium BCE, swords functioned simultaneously as weapons and as symbols of social status and power. Burial sites reinforce this pattern clearly: swords treated not merely as practical tools left behind after death, but as valuable possessions worth carrying into the next world entirely, buried alongside their owners as though the afterlife itself might demand protection, or status, just as much as the world of the living did. But the first sword was only the beginning of this story. Once humans understood they could reliably make long metal blades, an even bigger question followed naturally. How good could a sword actually become? Over the centuries that followed, sword makers kept experimenting, refining what earlier generations had already established rather than starting over from nothing each time. Blades grew longer, shapes became more deliberate, more carefully balanced between weight and control, so a sword could be swung quickly without exhausting the arm holding it. Casting techniques and construction methods grew increasingly standardized and specialized as the craft matured, passed down through workshops rather than reinvented by every individual smith. Surviving Bronze Age examples from Britain range from considerably shorter blades all the way up to swords stretching between roughly 70 and 90 centimeters, a British museum example weighing about 801 grams and demonstrating just how far sword making had advanced from those first tentative copper blades. And eventually, the underlying material itself would shift again entirely, opening the door to an entirely new age of weapons that lies beyond this particular story. The first sword wasn't a sudden invention, no single spark of genius, no one craftsman who simply decided to build a weapon unlike anything before it. It was the result of discovery after discovery, each one building directly on the last. Stone blades led to copper tools. Copper tools led to copper daggers. Daggers grew longer, forcing metalworkers to solve entirely new problems of strength and stability. Bronze solved what copper alone couldn't. Better construction solved what a blade alone couldn't. And step by step, across countless generations and, quite likely, across more than one region entirely independent of the others, all of that experimentation converged into something genuinely new, the specialized sword. The real invention here was never really the sword itself. It was the accumulated ability to control metal well enough to produce a blade that was long, strong, and reliable enough to actually survive combat. Today, making a sword can look almost effortless. Machines cut, grind, heat, and shape steel with a level of precision no ancient craftsman could have imagined, turning a process that once took a lifetime of accumulated skill into something a factory can repeat identically thousands of times over. But the people who made the very first swords had none of that. They had fire. They had stone pulled straight from the earth. They had metal, temperamental and difficult to master, that punished every mistake with a cracked or bent blade. They had patience, the kind measured across entire lifetimes rather than single afternoons. And they had generations of accumulated knowledge, passed carefully from one craftsman to the next, refined a little further with every attempt, every failure quietly teaching the next generation something the last one hadn't known. The sword may look like a simple piece of metal, but the first one represented something much bigger. The moment humans learned that with enough knowledge, even a piece of rock pulled from the ground could be transformed into a weapon,